Jayne Agency, I've owned the business for 12 years now. I spent a lifetime, probably since I was too young to understand what it meant to have a job. Inside of creative, the role of executive creative director for 25, 26 years. I was quite a risk taker inside of the creative industry. I was known for that. But I hit a point where I realized as a female that I was always going to be paid somewhere around 100 grand less, which is a big difference than my counterparts on either coast. And I had the data on that and I approached it and it didn't look like that was going to change. So I went off and started my own business. And when I did, I found that my passion for being able to work on projects that were not just about driving, cereal from being sixth choice, below in-store private label to, third, second, first in class was more about helping families figure out where they wanted their wealth to go, what 501c3s were trying to accomplish, and then also helping small and mid-sized businesses. And there was a connective tissue between all of those, which is you need to be very, very intentional with what you're doing with your resources. And so when you start talking about resources, things start coming down to what's strategic and what matters. And when you start having those conversations, people start behaving and listening differently about their own businesses, their own intentions, their own strategies and goals. And we even heard that with the Slater family earlier today. So at a certain point, I realized that we had done an extraordinary amount of work with 501c3s, and we started to see a consistency, and that's what today's presentation is about. So I'm going to start out with just saying, here's the table of contents. I'm going to give a little introduction, just a tad view on Jayne Agency, and then I'm going to introduce what I'm calling the characters for behind this presentation, which is 6 of about 12 clients that we had pulled research and data together. I'm highlighting 6. I'm not going to be specific about their stories like case studies, but just so you know, these are the characters behind, these are the brands behind what we'll be talking about today. Then we'll talk about the situation. I'll walk you right into the challenge. I think it's going to be reflective to a lot of things that people are feeling and going through on a regular basis. Then we'll talk about the solution. We have 6 techniques. So there's things that you can take away from today. Some you can implement with ease. Some are a little bit more infrastructure, structural, just laying groundwork in order to make those things happen. And then we'll go through with Q&A. So I tried not to make this the full length, but if somebody can just let me know when we're at the 20-minute mark so I can wrap up and make sure that we have time for questions, that would be really helpful also. So just right off the bat, just so everyone understands, I have dyscalculia, which is the numbers version of dyslexia. So me watching the time is unhelpful to everybody. So I just thought I'm very, very transparent about that. And it's awesome to be really, really talented in some places, because then when you have a complete drop off, it's okay. But I do have to be responsible and own it. So, all right. So actually, because of that disability, to me, clarity is everything. And I built the business around that and have attracted people who are obsessed with clarity as well. We've been around since 2009. Our data starts from then. We've been intense from the time we started. Our mission has always been to make the world more gooder. Now, when I put that stake in the ground, I didn't really realize where that was going to bring my company, but smack me smarter as the brand builder in the room. It works. We have really strong values that tend to align with major enterprises and 501c3s, but because we really focus our energies in increasing the diverse supply chain and the 501c3 space, you end up seeing that integrity over and over and over. Even if we didn't want to be, we would have to be held accountable that way. And so we're small by intention. We've grown really big, and I have reined us back in because that's where I was happiest. And I get asked about that a lot. Obviously, inside of the diverse supply chain, people would love for Jayne to scale and be able to push more through us. And again, that is part of the vulnerable population that 501c3s touch, but also that I work inside of every day. And it was a strong moment in realizing that the best thing I could do to help those around me was to hold true to what I needed. So you'll hear that throughout this presentation. So now I'm going to introduce you to some of the characters for today. Oral Health America is a brand that actually stopped providing its services under its name in 2018 and is now, I think they're part of the Dental Authority online. It's a website of an aggregate of dentists. County Care, which is the Cook County Healthcare System's insurance. It was one of 4 early Medicaid provider releases before the Affordable Care Act went into action. UCAN, which is a Chicago-based provider of youth and care and community services. They're the largest provider in the Midwest. And so between each of these, I would just say, just to give a sense, OHA was a $3 to $4 million organization. County Care was a 20 to 30 million. UCAN is 70 million. American Red Cross obviously is much, much bigger than that. You're talking about 50,000 employees and volunteers, US or globally. So doing work with American Red Cross. The WBDC, which is focused on the small business and vulnerable businesses throughout the entire Midwest. So they touch 7 states and their focus is on igniting business growth. They're more in the $5 million range. And then Magdalene House Chicago, which is tiny, it's below $1 million. So when we're talking about this, we're touching many, many different perspectives, but to know that they all had a very similar path of both conflict and solution is comforting, because when we talk inside the nonprofit space, sometimes the companies that are supporting a $70 million organization have less value for branding or strategy or culture than those at the below the $1 million mark, because that's all they have to depend on. And so I just wanted to share, these are universal truths. And when you look at that range, we're talking global, regional, local, completely excruciatingly local. And we say that this goes across all, it sort of says, okay, somewhere in here, I'm going to find something for myself. So I just wanted to introduce you to the characters behind the stories. So here's the situation. The need to connect our boards with our staff and the mission of our organization will determine whether we will not only remain, but thrive in the future. So this is something that I, as a brand builder and somebody who's out in the marketplace, speaking often, et cetera, I constantly hear something or something of this ilk from a lot of the 501c3 executive directors that I tend to network or interface with. And this was said by someone, Jack, a really phenomenal HR visionary and leader, Jacqueline Jackson. When I met her, she was at one job. She has been a 3-time client and is now my vice chair on a board that I am chair on. She's phenomenal. But when she said this, she didn't say it inside of like a big presentation with a group of people. She was in distress, right? It's a pretty statement now that it's bold and in orange on a white background, but this was a woman who had her head in her hands. And that was a scene that I saw often. And so over a series of projects, we started to see that there was a relationship between the business development process of people asking us if we would do a branding project, which Marlo mentioned, right? They went through a branding project. We started to see that the business development cycle revealed things for us. And storytelling in itself often unravels things. So you need to understand where something came from in order to understand where it's going to go. But on almost a consistent basis from the year 2009 till 2015, oftentimes the way a 501c3 would interface with our company would be to say, well, we need a new logo. And the conversation always went like this. Can you help us rebrand? And we would say, yes. Can you help us tell our real story beyond the mission? And we would say, of course. And then they would say, well, there's a problem there. We have a big span between what our staff believes our real story ought to be and what our board of directors feel our real story is. The subtext behind that was that when development went to close or provide a support case for someone, that what ended up happening with the staff was that as restricted revenue or income would come through, there was a complete disconnect on what needed to happen on a daily basis. So we started to see that there would be a problem if we invested resources in telling the story the way the staff wanted it, or the way the board of directors wanted it. What was happening was between development and the C-suite was completely different than the other two. And now we had 3 stories. So we would start digging, which we define as torturous for our clients, but we always found that they really enjoyed that because it started bringing things out into the open. What we would find was that there was this conversation about a generational gap. Don't worry, we're going to hit on this. It was that the staff, which delivers on a daily basis, communicated unrest, discomfort, and disengagement. The board, which governs, loses confidence. And then from the C-suite's perspective, there was a disconnect that undermines the mission and the message. And it really just became spaghetti. It became sand to have to start talking about. What we found was that it was not a gap. It was a misunderstanding, a generational discrimination. And it went in both and all directions, but there was a missing piece inside that discrimination that made it hard to solve it. But that discrimination caused catastrophic distraction. And so just for a second, and you can take a look at the slide that I have up here, but for a second, everyone just take a second to think about the board meetings that you're in where you just can't get past it, or no one can agree. So you decide, okay, well, we'll hold that budget over here for a while, but then the strategic plan starts to unfold and unravel. And now it's operationally becoming a problem to get what you promised beneficiaries to happen, right? It all just kind of falls apart. And we would see that constantly. In 6 out of 6 instances, we saw that the board ultimately had more empathy and connection, going back to Jimmy's moment where he said he found himself being more empathic with the delivery staff when demonstrated, when we shifted the lens by which they saw each other. We didn't change anybody, and we didn't tell anybody to behave differently. We just changed the way they saw and heard each other. And the same was true in reverse. The staff developed much more respect and empathy for the board, which removed a whole bunch of pressure off of the C-suite. And we'll touch on that briefly as well. The shift in lens revealed alignment. Now, I'm going to also ask everyone, as I read through these 5 assumptions, and I will read through them, it's one of the few times I'm going to read the slide directly. Take a minute to really be honest with yourself. You don't have to tell anyone, but if anybody wants to throw in the chat.
Just drove up. You must have passed her down at the bottom. Who did? Kelsey.
Could somebody go ahead and mute everybody? And I may have to unmute.
Thank you. So I want, if you feel like it, just throw out in the chat, yes, I've seen that. Yes, I've felt that. Or here's how that sounded in our organization. But this was 6 out of 6 instances consistently. There was no deviation. So the assumption, there was 5 assumptions, and we call these assumptions self-talk. And self-talk challenges the ability to build confidence and build great brands. And this is true not just within 501c3s, but within brand strategy, period. Self-talk can destroy a culture, which can destroy an operation, which can destroy a legacy, right? So when we're talking about meaningful missions, it's even more damaging because self-talk starts to get at the heart, not the head. And we want to avoid that quickly. So assumption 1, and also just ask yourself, who do you think is saying this? The board doesn't get this mission in today's world. That was the assumption 1. And we would track that conversation happening in interviews, in work sessions, even at scope development levels. Assumption 2, those millennials have no idea what it means to mind the mission. They don't care about anything and expect everything to come to them. And my day, we had to work hard. Assumption 3, I don't understand how to manage millennials. I can't get anything done. Assumption 4, I care so much about this mission, but it feels so bad to be part of this place. Those 4 assumptions were remediable. It was this 5th one we found that was absolutely damning. And that was when we would hear someone say, there is no way to fix this. That to us demonstrated poison, that no matter what we did with that individual's perspective, while we could bring the other 4 to a better place through culture, brand strategy, alignment, and some of the 6 techniques that we're going to talk about, and sometimes it only took 1, or even just talking about doing it, that 5th one was a defeatist point of view that very rarely, maybe in 2 instances, did we see that person recover. And so what happened was we started really listening for these, And as we started to talk with each team and point this out, they would start self-monitoring on these 4 assumptions once we taught them also and took them through the 6 techniques. So just, out of curiosity, how many people, you can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat, whatever, but it is a really good mindful moment to say, how many of us have said something like this, heard someone say something like this, or been frightened of something like this being said? Right? Because it's that last one that holds us as those responsible for the mission hostage in decision-making, leadership, etc. So I'm going to actually open up the chat just to take a look and see. Not a lot of activity there, but I did see a few people raise their hands. I can't really see Valerie, the conviction. Yeah, that's a good word for this conversation here. So when you step back for a second and you say, look, these 5 assumptions, these 5 components of self-talk were identified in every operation that we looked at. No one escaped it. There was no one that was in like we do it better than someone else. And that they were universal. It didn't matter what size they were. It means that all of us are victim or potential victims. Our brands are, our operations are, our people are, our donors are, our beneficiaries are, of the damage that self-talk can do, right? And when we laid that out, everyone started to listen a little differently. So I'm going to take you outside for a second, and I'm going to do some user-centered research with you for a moment and say, take what I just shared with you and put it over here. Now, knowing that those were client engagements and projects, we also went out and just reached out to a series of other really valued partners inside of the 501c3 industry. And so this was a quote. We asked someone to share with us, how do you feel you are interacting with the Gen Y, Gen Z generation? And where do you fit inside of the spectrum of everything from golden years to baby boomers to Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z? And so this is Alan. And he said very plainly, we said, what do you feel the challenge is in working? And he said, we have to be clear on our mission, vision, and direction. Otherwise, each employee and board member interprets them through their own lens, and we end up unfocused, trying to do everything, which doesn't work. Now Alan has no idea about our lens shifting conversation. This came from him directly, and it came in the last year and a half. We were doing a pulse to see how the generations were impacted through the pandemic. And in general, there was no impact. It actually was a benefit to the Gen Y and Gen Z generations. We didn't put any information about that in here, but it turned out that it was a benefit because the communication styles, the Zoom, the email allowed people to sort of slow down and think about things. And I'll explain that in a second too. But we asked Alan, where do you fit in that spectrum? And he said he's a Gen Xer all the way, baby, kind of very similar to what we heard Jimmy say earlier. And we asked him, what's your feeling on Gen Y and Gen Z? And he said, super passionate, highly energetic, love working with them without strong reining of them in. They just don't have the skills that we need, right? His challenge was that they don't have basic skills needed to channel that passion, and how to channel passion and keep them engaged becomes his problem as an executive director. And then second, they are often too impatient to do the work needed to gain experience and build skills. When we really probed on that, what was behind that for him was that no one has taught them, and there aren't really protocols in today's fast-moving world to do that. The pandemic forced us all to slow down and gave us a chance to breathe and say thoughtfully, oh, you know what? Maybe I could teach you about that now. Let me show you how the database works. Let me explain what it means to talk to a donor. These are things that we just weren't passing down over the last 15 years generationally to be able to help group people. So what came out of those pulses and the work that we had done in the past was that grateful moments inspire engagement and create relevancy. Let me explain a little bit more about this too. We have somewhere around 35 quotes that center behind this, actual quotes from different leaders, as well as the staff. And here's a couple anecdotes. My 21-year-old grandson is my IT guy on call. I can't ask my son for help. He gets mad at me. Can you believe my 18-year-old granddaughter got me on Snapchat? My daughter uses Facebook. Silly Facebook is for old people. Sorry, Facebook. Now, the person sharing these quotes were board members. The people they were talking about were their grandchildren. As we connected the fact that their grandchildren were of the same age and generation and behavioral demonstrations as the staff in general, they softened and they started to create relevancy. And as we brought the brand's perspective of the staff to the board under that lens, they became enlightened, they became ecstatic, they became connected, and all of a sudden they were thrilled at how close the perspectives on the mission really were. That is foundational work. We'll talk about that technique and how that happened. But the finding,
Brooke,
sorry.
it's Andrea. Hi, there's a question from Ramona. She would like to know if she can get a quick definition of Gen X, Y, and Z, and where do boomers fit into that?
Okay. So Gen X would be, myself, Jimmy, anyone who is in that 48, 46 to 50 something, 65-year-old at this point. I might be getting these numbers wrong because I know they've moved over time and I knew them for a long time specifically. Baby boomers would be the generation that came prior to the Gen X. Gen Y follows along and is in the like the 30 to 45-ish something space, backing up. And then the millennials are considered 35 through 21, and then up until 21, and anyone below that is considered Gen Y and Gen Z. So my 10-year-old son is a Gen Z, my 17-year-old is a Gen Y, and my 22-year-old is considered a Gen X. No, millennial, she's considered millennial. Does that help? There's actual specific time blocks for that.
So
Sorry.
Brooke, if I can help, somebody put a comment. Baby boomers were born between 1946 to 1964. Gen X.
Math for me is not going to work, but that sounds great.
Yeah. And somebody posted an article in chat. If anyone's interested, you can click on it and read more about generations.
I love this group already. Thank you. Okay. So what was happening inside of those discussions and the exercises that we were doing with people was that we were creating a relevancy between the board and the staff in terms of how to relate. So when we said, oh, well, you're able to relate with your grandson, he's your IT guy, he takes care of you. They were able to say, oh, okay, well, here's how I ask him questions. And here's how I feel like, he and I have a relationship that his parents seem to get involved in, and that becomes combustive. We started to see that that was mapping between the board, the C-suite, and the millennials. And it was consistent. And so when we created that lens, there was grateful moments, because what was really happening with the grandparent was, even though his grandson was acting as his IT person, the grandson was hearing stories, legacy, information, getting guidance, all of a sudden asking about what to do with his girlfriend when he goes to take her on a date for the first time. And now you've got relationships happening. And so as the board started to build those bridges with the staff, obviously not the same intimate questions, but having a way to relate with each other, you started to see things around brand story, brand alignment really easing up. That took a lot of pressure off of the C-suite. And we'll talk about what was happening inside that dynamic in a second. But what happened was we really related grandchild as the mentor and grandparent as the mentee, and the board members loved that. And they moved straight into it. And as a result, the relationship transitioned into one of acknowledgement and acceptance. And it really worked well. It really provided relevancy and strength. So I'm going to move on. Feel free to ask questions.
I'm going to pose a question, or I think just to sum up what I just heard, let's just agree that within the organization, there are three groups. There is the board, then the C-suite is your CEO, CFO, CTO, CDO, et cetera, your administration. And then typically your support staff right now could be more millennial. Is that a fair assumption for this conversation?
It tends to be, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So there is a second challenge, which is going to touch on what you just shared, which is the rock and the hard space. So the rock was more stringent regulations around 501c3s in the last decade and a half. As 501c3s started to come under more scrutiny, what used to be the younger generation moving into the C-suite was now under very different constraints, different integrity lenses, different stressors than the board had previously had to manage inside of, right? So as the board moved from being inside the C-suite into the board, their expectations around decision-making and how the C-suite needed to function didn't have alignment. And the staff didn't bear the burden of the stringent regulations the way the C-suite did. The hard space was that with this generational gap, the tension between the staff and the board, there was an exhausting drain on resources that the C-suite was really never going to succeed inside of. They did not have the flexibility or the range that the board expected them to have, as well as the staff, but they also didn't have the excess capacity to navigate between the two. And the more that tension happened, the harder it was for them to lead. So let's talk about that for a second.
Hey, Brooke, I'm just letting you know that it's been about 21 minutes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so this is Tammy. She's another person that is really, really profound in development. And she talked about Gen Y and Gen Z, and she said their willingness to share their views is always good for their feedback, helps to make us all as people in their organization better. However, their views are not held in isolation, and she felt like many times that became the problem. It was easy to hear and understand and relate to the views, but helping the staff understand that the views were relevant, but not in isolation to what the business reality of the operation of the 501c3 was. When asked, where does she fit in the spectrum? She said, I must be old because I don't really know the demarcations between those groups. And she was kind of funny about it. On Gen Y and Gen Z, she said, it's just more. It's just so much more. It's more apt to verbalize how they're feeling from a positive and a negative stance. And sometimes that could be really overwhelming for both the C-suite, the directors, and the board. You know, sometimes they're more apt to shut down and they are more recluse than anyone. And so she said the challenge was to embrace their more emboldened approach and help them stop hiding behind silence where there was disagreements on approach. And I think that sort of hit the nerve of what Jimmy and I had originally started talking about when we first met each other. So these are 5 techniques. I'm going to go through them somewhat quickly so that we can talk about them. And I'm not going to belabor them. I'm going to share them so that you can see how they worked and you'll start to see and hear how we brought the staff and the board and the C-suite together. But they start with platforming in stages, which gives everyone a voice. That can be scary. Custom surveys, which can also be damaging, which build relevancy instead of damage. Storytelling, so allowing everyone to master the narrative. Allowing the group to evolve together, making it personal, but building the group. And this is where people like Marlo and I, who are big D disc people, get to learn and let everyone else roll with us, or for us to roll with them. And then reflection, monitoring what matters. So once we know something's valuable, how do we make sure it sustains? So giving everyone a voice, platforming in stages. So what we found very quickly, and this was early in 2000, probably 10 or 11, we learned that we needed to really separate the board, the C-suite, and the staff to find out what was really happening for them in terms of their belief of the background and the 10 assets of the brand platform that needed to be created, where they had conflict with the other 3 groups inside of the organization, and what needed to happen in order for them to believe and buy into the others. Luckily, in almost every situation, there was a lot of connection already built into what people thought. It was just about allowing them to be heard without distraction and knowing that the others heard them and received them. So we call this platforming in stages. So we build brand platforms. We probably do that technique 2-3 times a week as a business. when we go into 501c3s, and even now when we're going into large enterprises around touchy topics like diversity and inclusion, sustainability, or even supplier diversity, we do it in stages where we allow each group to be heard and then integrate that together as a facilitator and a moderator. So it identifies disconnects, it demonstrates linkage and alignment really a lot better. And so that's the formula really to allow people to be heard and then create those linkages and alignments. It required self-awareness, patience, which we don't always have as leadership, perspective, and transparency. And transparency, it was really hard for the C-suite. We found the C-suite struggling with transparency. They didn't want ramifications from the board, and they didn't want to, like, I think the language that was used was they didn't want to let a genie out of the bottle that they couldn't get back in with the staff. The good news was when you allow people to be heard and you create rational reasons why things can and can't happen, we really saw people embracing clarity and brand strategy. So the results were that the staff felt secure in their understanding of the brand and the mission. The board had confidence in the staff, vice versa, and leadership was empowered to negotiate the outliers and lead the brand unapologetically. So by really like nailing it down and creating alignment through 90% of the organization, it was easy now to go in and just address what was outliers. And so what previously had been just an overwhelming amount of discontent was now narrowed down, focused, and able to be addressed. The second technique that we worked with people on that really changed us as a business, this was, a real, we were really, I would say, when you have to put your money where your mouth is or walk the walk, we had always used surveys as part of how we did research, but really building relevancy through a survey and not hurting an organization further by asking insensitive or irrelevant questions that had answers that were leading or could cause further pain and problems was important. And so when we really rethought that and we're working with the different 501c3s, going past highlighting the issue and tapping the actual pain and allowing that to come out in the survey in a safe, anonymous place was incredibly welcomed by all three areas that we were working with. It allowed us to address core issues. It helped link mindfulness to roles and responsibilities, mission and needs, which was super helpful inside of a couple of the things that we're going to share. It created concrete answers, which produces two things. When something is concrete and people can buy into it, they can say, yes, this works for me, or no, it doesn't, is a fundamental level of respect. So it created appreciation within the staff, no matter what age or generation they were, leadership and the board, that the survey was an act of caring, not a proof point to prove, demonstrate, or pursue. And it provided useful outcomes that the leadership could act on. Now, transparency was huge in this one, and not everybody was comfortable with it at first. Sometimes we had to gain everyone's confidence into surveying. Sometimes that was 2-3 initiatives in, but it required trust, goal orientation, transparency, really from the forefront. The results were that things could be talked about transparently. It's hard to argue with data. And when data is mixed with open-ended statements that people can share and express themselves with, then actions can be taken. Tangible impacts can be appreciated. And the survey created both story and data for storytelling. It really helped illuminate what was really critical and important, and it helped diminish that which was getting in the way, conflictual and harmful. The third is one that sounds really, it seems obvious, but it's really one of the hardest things to accomplish, which is storytelling. And it's not enough to just have Jimmy tell his story and Maxie tell his and Chris tell his. I'm looking at the names that are available, but let's say, one of those is the board member, one is the C-suite, and one is in the staff. Or to have 5 different staff members telling the story. I chose to work here because I worked here because I got a job here. This is a paycheck to me. Right? We need to have a narrative that is not just consistent, but able to be mastered. And so allowing the individuals to tell their story of the brand with discipline, creating a master narrative that people believe that they belong inside of is really important. So it lets story find its way to a proper place. And we did that not just by platforming in stages, but then bringing the stages together, showing everyone how it overlapped, bringing in the data and the stories, so that people had that substance. And it wasn't always an incredibly expensive thing. Sometimes these were grassroots things that we just guided the 501c3 on to do themselves, right? But it allows the individuals to tell their version of the story within their belief of how they fit inside the mission in the background. And then spending time to understand why people are committed has a lot to do with the role, the responsibility, the job, whether they're on the board, in the C-suite, or in the staff. And so one thing that this one required far more than the others was it really drew on empathy and resilience. A lot of times we saw people feel hurt or dismayed or even just kind of knocked on the ground, jaw dropped. We heard language like that. And their ability to come back and have empathy to bring themselves back into the narrative was critical. This in particular, this technique created brand fanaticism. So everyone had a place that was clear in the story. They felt good about that. And if they didn't, they opted out. It became a woven culture. And it became not a bad thing for someone to opt out. It became healthy. And it became even healthier for people to be more fanatical because they believed in and had proof points of what they were looking at. And then stakeholders that are brand fanatics are going to outperform any other organization on a prayer focus. So when we talk about stakeholders, we're talking about funders. If we think about the Slater family that we were listening to earlier, if they're seeing brand fanaticism and they're believing in this story and they believe in what they're hearing and they feel good about, and they talked about the fact that when an organization doesn't have that, they can feel it. They can smell them coming, right? I think that was the exact language. The storytelling is what creates that authenticity. Now, you've heard me touch on this one, which is the group evolution. So there's no way to just say to people, okay, well, we hired company X and they're going to take us from here and go there. It actually has to happen. The group has to have an evolution. It has to be allowed for that to be inside of the timing of things. People need time to gestate. They need time to go away. They need time to come together. And so one of the things that we did was we made sure, and we consistently make sure, that it's both personal, but building the group at the same time. So you've heard me talk about, this person felt this, and then we brought it to the group. That is a really important conversation to make sure people understand you can have your moment, you can be heard, but then you have to find your way inside the group overall. And so teaching people to have that connective tissue was really helpful, but then allowing the group as overall to evolve to the point where they stood separate from us. And we saw that happen too. So individual points of view morphing into a culture was something that, as you start to build that brand and you start to really test it and see how it's working, and you see how that strategy ties back into everything from operations to development, to how we deliver for the beneficiaries of the mission of the 501c3 is critical. And that had two steps: connections, which allowed everyone to reconnect to the call to the mission, connect the mission to job descriptions, and connect the job to each other as roles and individuals. So, well, if you're in development and you go out and you secure a restricted fund, have we talked about what that restricted fund would be used for prior to going out into development? And can I actually implement that, right? So if I am the director, the executive director, can I actually staff and support the funds that you just secured? And oftentimes that's a big conflict. I'm sure everyone on this event can take a moment to remember a moment where someone secured something and you need that money, but it doesn't make sense for what you have to deliver. So doing things like that really stopped or brought a quiet to moments like that. And it actually reversed it into a superpower where development and the staff and operations and the benefits needs are all directly aligned. And then the second was commitments, committing to small achievable actions with visibility. So as the staff says, oh, well, we're going to get that done. We'll get less done, but get it done on time and get it done the way you committed to. So that the faith starts to get built between the C-suite, so that the C-suite's promises to the board start to make sense. And in reverse, right? So all of those individuals involved were asked to make small commitments to each other that could be achieved, that could be seen. A lot of times people make commitments and they're like, well, you can't really see the activities that I'm doing for development. That created a lot of distrust within the staff. When the staff didn't trust what development was doing at the time, it was really hard to believe in the brand. That showcases leadership's commitment as well. and allowed for full staff participation. So instead of just senior people being involved in creating confidence in the board, confidence was created organization-wide. The result was an engaged culture across the generations. And once the cultures are engaged, and once the generations were engaged, it realigned values and it created a high-performing, nonstop, can't stop, won't stop, strategically aligned force of incredible humanity. And I was really intrigued as I was listening to the Slater family. It didn't matter to me how much they managed in terms of funding for their philanthropy. What I was intrigued by was the alignment between the generations, so distinct, right? Lewis was so distinctly not the same generation as his parents. And you heard them talk about the fact that they had to start with him at a young age and bring him along. But when he came into his own voice, everyone probably shook a little bit like, where is he going with this? But when you have that alignment from a strategic standpoint, and you heard him say, well, it wasn't always like that, we had to create that, then you've got that incredible force of humanity. And that's the ideal, right? So group evolution really affords us that ability to sort of like marinate and bake inside of what it is that our mission should be. And then reflection. And this seems so obvious. And whenever we talk about it with people, they go, yeah. And then we start to break it down and they go, oh, wait a minute. So monitoring what happens. So creating discipline around recognizing performance of individuals and groups. So you may have heard me mention that I'm on a board. When I took over as board chair, I realized it had been 3 years since any outward visible recognition had happened for anyone that was on the board or any of the committees, right? The first thing I did was just build a 5-minute moment of recognition into the board agenda for every time that we're going to meet now. It's that simple. Recognition. Build it into agendas, build it into policies, procedures, recognize it, and make recognition not just things that are good, but things that we could do better as well. So it makes reporting a thing, like a real thing. And when reporting is a thing, everyone sits up straighter. Everyone looks forward or dreads what's happening. Dread is okay because it means we can fix and solve things. And a lot of times people didn't want to talk about reflection because they didn't want to look backwards. But it's so helpful when you look back and go, wow, look how far we've come. Recognizing both board and staff, keeping the links alive between the structures is so critical. They both need help remembering each other's working hard. And then creating awareness of positive and negative progress during those standard meetings, making that something that is a discipline, not just a nice to have. But that becomes the story of the brand, that becomes the data points, that becomes the story that development can go out and believe in, that becomes what our donors are responding to, that becomes what the beneficiaries reap, the savior inside of. And then the requirements for this one are a little different and they were a little harder than the others, but the consistency in building process. So sometimes building that process takes a little bit of time. Sometimes it's undoing things. Like I had to undo some things. I had to redo some things. I had to introduce new things. I had to build things. And I had to bring people along. I had to allow for group evolution to happen. And being prepared, like taking an hour to think about how those things fall into an agenda. So it goes out inside the consent agenda. So it goes out to the board the right way. So there's time to be reflecting and asking questions and allowing the board to do the work. That means that the staff has to do that work all the way farther ahead. That means that the C-suite has to be managing that, right? So process, preparation, and thinking about those things. People don't realize how critical that is to brand. And they don't realize the brand is what carries us through the hardest times of all, right? So again, this one really unexpectedly drives back towards brand fanaticism. Awareness of project in tangible forms like reports, proof points that give context to stories, monitoring that's tied to the brand, the platform, and the strategy. So if your brand stands for X, let's make sure we're delivering and talking about X. And if we are delivering and talking about X, let's understand what it takes to deliver on X. What's the support for the proof that we promise to do what we do and that we've done it, right? And then the monitoring is tied, oh, I said that one already. It's the shared experiences that the team can reflect on, share. So things like, wow, we nailed that in recruiting. We got the candidate that we wanted. Or fundraising, you know what, we thought that was a reach, but those people really loved what we had to say and they are now a 5-year donor with Renewable, right? Or problem solving, like this felt like this was going to be really hard and really sticky and really painful, but we knocked it out of the park and we just turned this into the greatest strength inside our organization. And what that leads to is new age governance. And a lot of what Jimmy has been talking about and all of the different great leaders, I popped in and out yesterday and I was able to sit in a little bit more today, is really about bringing us back to a place where we're governing for the right reasons with pragmatism, logic, connection, humanity, right? And so, you start to talk about that, and reflection really gives us the ability to say, are we or aren't we doing what we said we would? And if we are, let's celebrate that. And if we're not, let's get on it. So,
Brooke, this is Andrea. There's a question. These techniques and steps are all used for both staff and the board, ? Do you do one before the other? How do you facilitate the communication between the staff and the board? A joint session in our shop, not all staff attend board meetings.
So we did not do this in board meetings. This was not board meeting work. We did this in stages where outside the board meeting, we had sessions with the board. Outside of, standard operating procedure, we had work sessions with the staff, and then we also had separate sessions with the C-suite. And so it felt like if the board was going to do their session as a board meeting, the staff seemed to not respond or accept and embrace it. But when we were able to say, listen, everybody has gone through the exact same process, has had to make some commitments in their day, has had to move some things around, everyone, oh, okay, well, I can too. And so I think that answers your question. The techniques were across the board for everyone involved. And as everyone saw each other participating, like I remember when we were working with the OHA team, when the staff heard that the board was willing to even support this and pay for it, they felt a lot better. When we told them that they would be meeting separate from the board, they were scared that the board was going to reject what their version of the brand platform was. When we shared the findings with the board instantly wanted to reject certain things. But as we shared and rolled the whole thing out, and we talked about and hit some of those triggers around the generational discrimination, they really responded and started to embrace. And when we shared that back with the staff, they were really, really happy. Then we brought everybody back together. So it was an intense facilitation. And that's where we say it's platforming in stages. We had to really let it happen in stages. Lots of facilitation, yeah. Yes, it was a lot. But it was well designed, well received, well participated. Did I miss any other questions?
I have a question, if it's okay, Brooke.
Absolutely.
Brooke, but I could wait till you're at the end of your deck because I'd want to bring everybody else. So do you want to finish your deck first? Oh. Well, that's great. And you generously agreed to send people the deck, and we're excited about that. Let me go here. Brooke, now this is obtuse, which what I'm about to share. And but in the last session, we talked about the need to be transparent. And I'm going to share something that I hide in my heart and that I also occasionally tell people. And I'd like you to see if you can tell me why I feel that way, why it's wrong, and what I can do about it. So I'm going to tell you something that I hide in my heart. It's a prejudice. And maybe you can tell me why I feel that way, why it's wrong, and what I can do about it. And it's this. It's somewhat of a joke, but I'm not interested in talking to anybody that's under 42. I think that's wrong. I feel convicted having heard this presentation, but I think that's kind of really practical. And maybe you could just jump in and respond to it.
Because sometimes it's just exhausting. Sometimes it's just painful. Sometimes you feel like you're so far ahead and you're going to have to slow down and explain things, or you're going to get a contrarian type point of view, or you don't know what to expect, or some of the reactions are really sometimes feel so off the charts. And I don't know if that's tapping what it is, but
Hold on, my goodness, you took away the toxic guilt and shame. You told me why I feel that way. But in order for us to make progress, and by the way, I'll walk into my wife's office and I'll say, I'm dying here. And she'll say, honey, you're not dying, you're just uncomfortable. So thank you for explaining that there's a level, different varied levels of uncomfortableness. Give me one tip on how to grow in that area.
just slow down.
Slow down.
Just slow down. We're all going to get there together. And by the way, and believe me, I've had to say this in both directions. Okay. Someone helped you and you owe it to pay it backwards. Right?
And Brooke, the people that helped me are in this conference today. And what's so bad is they're 20 years older than me.
Right? But you didn't get to where you were without someone taking time to bring you along, right?
Oh, you're killing me.
I know, it's harsh.
It's just so true. It's all true.
But when I talk with the younger generations, I say, how could you possibly understand what they have to burden? You haven't burdened it yet. How could you possibly know all of the answers? They don't, and they've got 25 years experience on you. Now, what we found was that the older generations can't do it alone. You need to bring the others along. You need to pass the legacy on to someone. So at some point you have to trust someone. So I'll give you an example. You have no problem talking with Lewis Slater because you have a relationship with him, right? You two, I highly doubt that if the two of you were in a bar socializing, that you would be the likely suspects to hang out with each other if you didn't know each other, right?
We are an odd couple and it's wonderful.
Right. And so it's highly likely that almost every other person under 42 has that to offer you also.
Stop it. Leave me here.
So,
By the way, we're going to take a few more minutes because I did not realize I'm not patronizing you, but we are experiencing genius here. And friends, evidently the Jayne Agency and Brook are really serious about supercharging the organization and having it achieve significant impact. Let's go to gallery view and let's have the group do questions, comments, and pushback.
I've got a question I'd like to answer that's kind of similar to yours, Jimmy, which is an observation that I've made or an impact that I've had or I've felt related to intergenerational communication. And that is, and I'm a little bit confused because earlier in the presentation, it seemed like one of the comments was that the younger generations, I don't remember if it was Z or Y or millennials, or I'm still trying to get my head.
they get looped together.
Yeah, but there was it seemed like there was a statement that generically said that they will talk a lot, they'll give you a lot of information, and that might be different from what an older generation might be used to. In my experience, completely, empirical, not researched or anything, but it just seems like the younger generations have learned to be extremely indirect. They're so afraid of offending anybody that they don't actually ever say anything, which to me is a contradiction to what you were saying earlier, that they're going to be very direct and give you a lot of feedback. Can you
I didn't say direct.
What's that?
Actually, what we saw in research was that they shared a lot. That's what the comment was.
Right, they shared a lot.
They share a lot through text. They share a lot through email. They share a lot through lobbing comments inside of meetings.
Okay.
Right. And so it's not about direct or indirect. It's that it's a plethora.
Okay.
And so what was really sitting inside of most of those staff members, and they admitted that they did this, they came straight out and said, look, they're never going to respond to my direct statement. So I'm just going to keep saying it in 15 different ways until someone responds to me. Like the attitude was, I'm going to wear someone down until they can't take it, or I'm going to retract and withhold and become disgruntled. And that's where people get like, I'm not sure how to interact. I don't know what to do. And the real solution was, if you're not hearing it or you're not under, just ask. Like that was the easy, simple answer. Like, I need some advice from you. I need some information from you. I think I'm hearing something, but I'm not sure. Can you help me
And
understand?
then they get more direct when you ask like that?
Sometimes it takes a little time because they don't trust you, right? If
Okay.
you think about what's been happening, it depends, and it really does depend on what's been happening inside the environment that you're in, because I've seen situations where it's really phenomenal. I'll give you an example. The 501c3 that I am the board chair for, the YPB, the Young Professional Board, is kicking, they're doing amazing. But when they started, the main board didn't want anything they were like, what are we going to do with a YPB? Like, we can barely get ourselves together. But as the YPB, they just kept asking for help, and they just kept asking for things. And that was a turnoff. And then they stopped asking for things, and then they started doing things, and that was a turnoff. And finally, a couple of us intervened and just gave them some guidance and mentorship. And they're just doing amazing. And the thing they say every single time that there's a liaison meeting is, we could not do this without your mentorship. Right? But the questions didn't come like, can you guys teach us how to raise funds? They came like, if we're going to do an event, how are people going to pay for things? How do you unpack that? You have to unpack it, right? So
Right.
we're able to unpack stuff, right? We've all got 20, 30 years of leadership, team dynamic, et cetera. But what happens is the generations come together and they freeze, right? So if one thing I could give to everyone on this call is, if you're experienced in unpacking it, it doesn't matter which generation you're coming from, just start pulling the thread, right? It's just like, well, okay, I'm confused. Can you help me with my little space of confusion? Nope, don't go over here, shiny fishy syndrome. Come back to my point of confusion. Oh, now we have a connection. Now we're having a conversation. Now we're outlining something. Now we're solving something.
I just want to jump in and say, Brooke, you pierced my heart. Jimmy, somebody brought you along. I said that I don't want to speak to somebody that's under 38. That is nano accepted naturally. Nano members, we all have shared values. But then I looked up and I saw Hall Powell, and he met me when I was 32, and Dr. Robinson met me when I was 33, and Redford met me when I was 30. So I think an appropriate guilt for even speaking that into the atmosphere. Who's next for this brilliant presenter, Brooke Foley?
Brooke, there's a question from chat that I didn't want to lose from someone. Elizabeth, how would you connect this information with an agency with many different programs, with different missions, visions, and some funding sources from government and other sources that all fall into the main agency mission and vision of an organization?
That is a really great sprawling question. Let me see if I can find it in here so I could dissect it. Where did you find that? Do you mind copying and pasting it and dropping it? Oh, I found it. Okay. So it would be easy to say, well, that's like the Red Cross, or, but I'm actually going to highlight one of the clients that we showed, one of the characters that we introduced in the beginning, UCAN Chicago. They had somewhere over 75 programs, 5 or 6 different disciplines. They had 4 boards. And then they had a staff of 700 people, right? They're a big operation. And we shared with them the philosophy of platforming in stages. And when we did that, we saw high levels of rejection in every single stage. We had to allow that to happen. When we allowed the rejection to happen, when people were able to voice their concerns, their pain points, their frustrations, then we were able to start talking about, okay, so you got that out and we've talked about that. Let's put that over here as a barrier. And we did that inside of a clearly structured process. We took everyone through a process where we talked about financial goals, which was level setting. Then we talked about background. How did the organization get to where it is in your belief? Then we talked about objectives. Then we talked about what was in the way. And that one exercise about what was in the way coming after talking about financial objectives changed the way every single group thought about brand and the purpose that they themselves fit inside that brand. And so it's structure, it's facilitation, it's allowing human need to take place. It's not structuring the meeting to say every minute that we're doing has to deliver back on something financially. It's that every minute that we're together, we're allowing the brand to unfold, the person's personal brand to unfold, and then tie it all back together at a point that's appropriate. When we found, and inside your question in particular, different missions, visions, funding sources from the government and other sources that fall into main agency mission. So they had half of their funding sources were tied to government, half their funding sources were tied to private sector, mostly individual donor. And what was happening inside of their brand on a daily basis was a conflict of, this is the mission that we are sourced to serve by the government. They have the highest youth in care numbers. They're the lobbyists that changed ward of the state into youth in care. They have political requirements that they need to fulfill inside of the government funding. At the same time, they needed to say non-secular. And at the same time, they had private donors of high net worth, and they were tied directly into the Catholic Church. They were founded out of the Catholic Church inside of World War I, right? And inside of this process, we had to normalize and stabilize all of those different tension points and points of view into one single brand platform. Once we were able to create the single brand platform, we were able to demonstrate how all of the different visions for the different aspects of the mission. So while they started out as youth in care, the largest quote unquote orphanage in the state of Illinois and then the Midwest, they had moved into being the primary source of workforce development and violence prevention. Those three things don't necessarily seemingly fit inside of a single mission. However, when the mission became more about the community and less about serving the youth alone, certain donors that were private based decided maybe this isn't right for me. So we had to stabilize that as well. We also had to talk very plainly, and this was really hard, and this made a lot of people on the board not like me at first, but that if the mission has grown and it's supported by the government funding and it's supported by the majority of individual funding, then it might be time for certain donors to find other organizations, because strangling the overall mission growth for a single or multiple donors that had a different point of view wasn't going to be helpful. In the end, those donors were phenomenal. They were really, they just wanted to see that the organization was going to do what it needed to do to be sustaining. And in the end, they had a large voice in it. They were heard. They were heard equally to the staff member that was dealing with violence prevention on a daily basis, going in and handling teen mom homes. And they were both hearing each other. And so it's hard work. I mean, I always say that the work that we do for our nonprofits is much harder than the work that we do for our private enterprise or corporates, and that we expect our private corporates and enterprise to pay for it.
Brooke, I want you to just take 30 seconds because we have to go to our next speaker, who I'm so excited about. But how can any one of our NANO members contact you? Because I think there is a lot of strings to be pulled in these different organizations that you've been speaking to. And I think you're brilliant. Just let us know how we can contact you.
So I would say reach out to me. You can reach out to me directly. We'll put my information in here. I would absolutely reach out to Andrea. So I would copy us both. And we will get back to people directly. We are direct responders. I tend to get to know everyone and their needs before they get introduced into the organization. Andrea oftentimes will sit inside of that with me, but feel free to reach out. And you can call our main number. You can call either of our cell phones directly. We're very accessible.
Well, it has been no small hour here. And I think that some of us may not appreciate what it means to be serious about growing a nonprofit, and Brooke Foley is. So thank you for a wonderful session, pal. I can't wait for us to do more.
Thanks for having us. There's so much ahead, right?